Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, with the second lecture on series on Indian writings in English and today once again we would be conducting a session and in today's session we would be talking on making of Indian writing in English. This is the introductory lecture. The first part of the introductory lecture was done and we would be continuing further and would be discussing more on making of Indian writing in English, and we have once again with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor from Delhi University, and we believe that he has maximum to give us. Let's enlighten ourselves with what he is going to give us today. So, hello sir, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thanks Kritika for your kind words and welcome viewers. This is the second part of the series and it is still the introduction, because it's a long topic. The journey of Indian writing in English begins somewhere in the 18th century and it takes almost 200 years to complete it. Well, the journey of not Indian English writing, but the presence of the British who generated circumstances in which this writing emerged, because the writing continues and in fact greater gusto than was the case in the 19th and 20th centuries. We last time finished the argument of circumstances in the 19th century that allowed a new trend of writing emerge from within themselves, and it was quite crucial in the sense that English writing wouldn't have happened if certain things were not there in the 19th century. And there were many ifs and buts, there were many ups and downs in the 19th century. There were plus points, there were minus points, there were conflicts within India. There might have been conflicts also within the British mind. Therefore, we will take up all these as independent issues when we come to the lectures. But since I am just introducing the idea of this course, so I would suggest that at the end where we left last time, we had reached a particular stage in our argument, and that stage was that towards the end of the 19th century, circumstances, conditions in India have come to a pass where something new will emerge further. And I talked about the founding of the Indian National Congress in 1885, the last but one decade of the 19th century. And even though it was headed by a Britisher, it had the perspective of Indian industry and facilities that could be provided to the industry in India as well as to the political system. And from there on, an era begins, and that era causes a defining of Indian writing in English in a manner that may not be clear at the time, but will soon pave the way for the independence of this writing somewhere in the 1930s. So the topic today would be kept in mind as one in which Indian writing in English comes to terms with itself. It is not clear as to what it's going to be. It's not like the 19th century character of the Indian English writing, because as I said in the previous lecture, inspiration largely came from two things. One, that there was an Indian middle class which had access to education in English, and the second was that influences from Britain, influences from English literature also came, and they somehow determined and inspired writers and their writing. So that writing was stuck somewhere in the 19th century. It was limited in scope. It was limited, for instance, to the universities, to the urban centers, to the people who would understand, who would read and write in English, and it would not exactly percolate to the common reader as writing in English. So that was the condition. Now, this condition is not from within. It's a condition that is coming from somewhere else, from outside English writing, Indian writing in English. And today I would like to present a kind of dilemma because that dilemma will explain how English writing in India will see itself much later than this dilemma was resolved. And this dilemma is resolved somewhere in the 1930s. So this particular part, 1885, 1890 up to 1930, that's the period that we'll take up, and I'm introducing it point-wise. For instance, I would say, and here the help will come from the things that I jotted down, that there aren't authors coming forward and giving voice to the responses at this time. You can't pinpoint writers who write regularly in this period. The writers who write, the writers who are with whom we come in contact, so far as this peculiar writing is concerned, these writers have already started writing in the 19th century, and they are senior writers. And from 1990 onwards, those who write, then they were the ones who started writing much before it. So there are no new writers coming up, and the question is why? Why is it that no new writers are coming up in this particular period? And this is a question that we should ask ourselves. In fact, when I was preparing for mentally, I was preparing for this lecture, then I was faced with this dilemma as to why a whole generation of writers in India did not come forward at this time who would use English as a medium of expression. And I found that in most of the books of history of Indian writing in English, this part had been somehow sidestepped. Writers did not talk about it. Perhaps there were no writers. Perhaps there were writers scattered, in the urban centers, and they wrote occasionally. Then the question is, why did this happen? And the answer would be, that English at that point of time is not the language in India, not the language of India. There are certain individuals, there are certain groups, who write in English, but then those who write, the writing gets confined only to them. It doesn't come out openly. For instance, there are not many schools and colleges which teach English in a manner that people would adopt it as a medium of expression. English would be taught, to of course tell about the English writing, popularizing the English writing, the British writing. But more than that, it will be a kind of communication between the government higher officials and the ordinary masses. And when it comes to the masses, then English would not be used because the masses don't understand English at that time. So that way, there is no encouragement coming from the development of English in India, and that encouragement should make writers express themselves in English. That encouragement is not coming. So maybe that's the reason. And those who do have a distinct past of experiences emerged in the mid-19th century. So, for instance, Gandhiji keeps on writing. He's a writer in English. He's an Indian writer in English. He writes diary, he writes journal, he writes books. He talks about his experiments with truth. He has become an activist already, and he has been there in South Africa. And very soon, in the first decade of the 20th century, he would write that famous book which is in the news even today, Hind Swaraj. That also is written in English. So, but Gandhiji starts writing in the 1880s. And then, this great leader of India, he keeps writing later. The other example is of Tagore. Tagore starts writing once again in the 1880s, and he writes fiction, he writes poetry, he writes in Bangla as well as in English. And if he writes sometimes in Bangla, then some of the things he translates into English. So imagine Tagore writing, Ghare Bahire, the home and the world, in Bangla initially, but then he, along with another person, translates this book into English. And the book, the Home and the World, also becomes as famous as the original novel. So they think of Sarojini Naidu. Sarojini Naidu is a contemporary of Gandhi and Nehru, and she would have got inspiration for writing in English from the ethos of the 19th century, and she was a poet in her own right. But then she could be dubbed today by the historians of writing in English in India as this is how she is called. She is dubbed as romantic singing bird. What does romantic singing bird mean? It simply means that she is inspired by British romanticism, and romanticism in Britain, as it comes to India, is a trend. that is steeped in imagination, that is steeped in a kind of magic that is outside the social world. So people don't belong to their world. People want to remain in the realm of fantasy. They want to fantasize. They want to create an alternative world in their own mind. This is what Romanticism is. This is what Romantic poets are. And Indian writers would have definitely taken kindly to this kind of a trend that was available at the time, coming from England, and they started writing likewise. I talked about it, the romantic streak in Indian writing in the mid and latter half of the 19th century. And when Sarojini Naidu writes and continues writing much later than this, then she has taken her inspiration from the 19th century romantic trend in Britain, and then she continues with it. Does she talk about India? Yes, she talks about India. But she is not talking about India that is there in front of her. Or if she picks up the examples from there, then she molds them according to her fantasy. So they are not the same characters as they sees them on the road or in the household or in the marketplace. And she turns them into some kind of a figure or some kind of figures, that appeal to our senses, that appeal to our emotions, etc., but which may not appeal exactly to our understanding of the Indian reality at the time. So there are writers. I've named three writers. Gandhiji, Nehru also starts writing, in the latter in the early 20th century. But these writers started writing earlier. Of course, Nehru was born in 1889, I believe. So he would be writing in the second decade of the 20th century, and he would converse. He would exchange notes with fellow leaders, either in Hindi, Urdu, Kashmiri, or in English. So these writers are there, but are they writers? Are they? Can we call them Indian English writers? This is a question that you have to sort out. This is a question that I have to sort out. They are political activists. They use English wherever the use of English is needed, and then they are learning very fast other Indian languages. So maybe the reason that I was going into can be guessed as the reason that people now are more and more mass oriented. Leaders are talking about the interests of the masses, about the condition of the masses, because from the early 20th century onwards, the fight becomes clear between British imperialism on one side and the Indian masses on the other. And if you have to galvanize, if you have to mobilize masses in India in the first half of the 20th century, then the only alternative available to you and to me at that time would be taking the Indian languages seriously. If they are not developed, to develop them. If they are developed, one should use them. And therefore, most of the writers in India, even though they would be well read in English, they would think of writing in Indian languages. And that is why that there is a spurt in the writing of the Indian languages at that time. And this spurt could this kind of progress, this kind of capability in Indian writing in Indian languages was not discernible, was not seen in the 19th century. I don't want to go into those reasons because that's not my topic today. But then, if more and more people in the 20th century talk about the Indian conditions in Indian languages, then a kind of discouragement occurs among the people who might have thought of expressing themselves through English. So maybe that's one reason why the Indian national movement, spreading at that point of time, withholds appeal for the writer in English. Maybe that's the reason. The second thing that I want to talk about this period, because this is a period of problematizing. This is a period of dilemma. I started with that. So let me talk about the second point, that than English, Indian languages have received a boost and are moving towards the center of social thought, center of social feeling, leaving little scope to English, still an elitist and isolated scene of venture. So I've touched upon this point, but then if you talked at that time in English, if you expressed yourself in English at that time as a writer, then what would happen would be that you would be cut off from the ordinary masses. And not that you would not be talking about Indian conditions. Even if you talk about Indian conditions, people would think that you are using a language of the enemy. Therefore, you are not our friend, you are somebody else's friend. And well, the third charge that will be laid at the door of these people would be that they are being elitist. They want to talk in a foreign language about Indian conditions, and that nobody would understand their message, and therefore they want to keep themselves away from, apart from others. They don't want to be called, common masses. That they are citizens, of a different kind, on a different pedestal. They are closer to the British. They move around in circles, in places, in clubs, etc., where Englishmen come and they interact with them. Now, this scene is very well captured in one of the novels by A.M. Foster, who he wrote on Indian conditions. The novel is quite famous, Passage to India, and there he shows a kind of scene in the club where rich and well-educated Indians come to the clubs where Englishmen also come, and then they talk with them at a different level. But imagine if somebody went to a club and talked in English and then came out and wanted to communicate something to the ordinary person, then it will be very difficult for the ordinary person to appreciate him or her. And therefore, this elitism was one of the banes of the writing in English in India at that time, and that would have kept a large number of people belonging to the new generation. It would have kept them away from writing in English, and that's why people were active, and if they were active, they had to talk the language of the common masses. So elitism was one charge because of which many writers would not write in English at that time. But then writing occurred continuously in the the first decade, the second decade, and the third decade. Writing continued. Tagore kept on writing, Gandhiji kept on writing, Nehru wrote, others also wrote. But then that was not the literary kind of an expression. There was an expression of thought at the most, and since thought also is an integral part of writing anywhere in the world, therefore it also had a role to play in the Indian writing in English. But after having said that, one should realize that conditions would later on be created for the writing in English to emerge, and well, maybe things are brewing somewhere under the lid, and if they come out in the open, they'll require time. They would require a very encouraging atmosphere, and when that atmosphere occurs, then after a decade or so, new generation will come and they will start writing in English. And by that time, who knows, when 1930 appears, then there are a large number of people all over India, and they understand English, and in the meantime they have read a lot of literature also, not just the English romantic literature, but other literature. So there is a kind of a clientele, there is a kind of a big readership of English in India towards the 1930s. So maybe at that time something will emerge. Till that time, as I said, things have been brewing. The third point that I want to make with respect to this dilemma, that English writing is not very strongly present in the cultural scene in India, would be explained in terms of the third point that I am going to make. A few happenings, I say, of momentous proportions take place and directly challenge British supremacy. This didn't happen in the 19th century. The challenge came only once, that was in 1857. After that, the challenge died down. Before 1857, well, people were kind of assuming a pattern, following a pattern. Britishers would, at least put up with them, if not exactly crush them, because they were critical, and yet they didn't feel any kind of threat coming. But in the 20th century, one will see that more and more threat is growing in the first 20 years, and the threat came in two forms. And these are examples, that will explain once again the earlier point, why English could not be a medium of expression for literary feelings and emotions. So you have, for instance, 1905. There is a division in Bengal. It is called Banga Bhang or whatever, and that is an outburst of radicalism. And there is that famous novel by Tagore, I referred to it earlier also, that there are people who think that Britishers should be resisted militarily, should be resisted radically, they should be attacked. The British made goods also should not be welcome in India, and because if you buy British goods at that time, then you will be boosting their economic interests. So these things plus an attack on the Britishers directly, that was being suggested immediately after 1905, and this somehow unnerved the Britishers, and they wanted to find an answer to this. Of course, the movement could not spread to the masses, because some people were angry with the Britishers, and maybe sometimes the voice of anger against the British would be there confined only to a few groups, active groups, and it will not reach the masses, and there will be shrillness in the protest of Indians against the British in the beginning. But then the British started feeling that certain corners were coming up as explosive, and some kind of activity was happening there, and unless it was curbed, unless it was sorted out in a manner that Britishers would feel at peace with themselves and safe in the country, therefore they started taking measures. But then that they take measures and that they feel threatened, and that this kind of thing might emerge. This is what they are apprehending. Therefore, the scene had changed in the beginning years of the 20th century, and this was one important happening. And the anger could be seen all over India, and in the different communities, not exactly at the level of the masses, but then the middle classes. So you have some poets coming at that time, like Subramanya Bharati, who has the roots in the 19th century, but then who is moved by the emotion of nationalism. You have the early Aurobindo, who is a great nationalist at that time, and who wants to talk about India as a country which has a culture of its own, and that culture matches in power with that of the British, and therefore you would say, why not assert ourselves? So when these voices, these nationalist voices in India emerge in 1910, 1915, 1920, then the Britishers feel that there is a kind of link between these and 1905, and that something has to be done to curb it and to control it. The other important movement in this particular segment of time was the First World War. First World War is not exactly touching at that time the Indian interests, except that the people who ruled India then, the Britishers, they were a party to the First World War. They were fighting battles somewhere in Europe, and India, being a colony of the British, had to indirectly take part in the war, and if army troops had to be sent, then obviously they would be sent from India. So some people later on also criticized the British policy and said that they were using the Indian masses as cannon fodders. They had no interest of their own. India was not directly involved. If Britishers won the war, India would not get any benefit out of it, and therefore they were being used only as cannon fodder. But then this cannon fodder part, and that a large number of Indian soldiers would be killed in the First World War, and their homes would be totally shaken by the death of the earning member, and the person who would give them protection, etc. So something started happening at the grassroots. So these two movements, the first movement of the 1905, where Bengal is divided, and where people are very angry with the Britishers and their policies, and the second thing that the First World War occurs, and in that war devastation indirectly happens also in the social scene of India. So these two things will somehow pave the way for an anti-British emotion, and this anti-British emotion is not confined to the elites, it is confined to the masses. It is spreading to the masses. It is taking the British imperialist with its horrifying face to the village, to the small town. And since in the meantime reform movements of the 19th century have started bearing fruit, so people are thinking more and more, they are emerging into what is called the domain of modernism, and they are leaving their orthodoxy behind with education, with secular thought, with political action. People are becoming modernized, and this modernization will definitely create conditions in which a new kind of literature can be written later. But then in the first and second decades, you see that in Indian languages there is a kind of a spurt, and that spurt is also being felt at the level of the people who know English. So what will this English knowing people do in such a situation? Now this is a point to consider, and this point emerges from the background of these two movements that I have talked about. And I also would say here share this thing with you, that when the Britishers feel unnerved and anxious, when they are anxiety ridden in the time then one should keep in mind that something is going to happen even to those elites who have been earlier supporting the British or using their medium, using the medium of their English, and they are coming to terms with their own feelings and emotions. Many of them have already learned Indian languages and they are writing in English, but since they have a kind of proficiency about writing in English, so maybe a kind of churning is happening in the minds of those who know English, who are conversant with the developments in English and European literature, and they might later on think of expressing themselves in English, at least for the benefit of one another, and their number is increasing. So that way things are definitely happening. I have already, friends, talked about Tagore, Bharati and Sarojini Naidu briefly in order to explain that they had their roots in the 19th century, but then they were moving very fast towards what can be called the 20th century ethos, of which they are the builders and in which they actively participated. And then finally I say that the political scene in India is also changing at this time, and mass movements will be soon launched immediately after the First World War, and that is going to create conditions in which English writing in India will have a new fillip, will have a new spurt of energy, and maybe it is that which causes the Indian middle class to come forward to think at the level of the masses, to think at the level of the national sentiments, to think at the level of significance of politics in India, and that politics might take the whole country, partly also informed by what the middle class thinks. So these things will in a way converge somewhere on this point, that an anti-British unity is the need of the hour, and for which writing in English also can contribute something. So I finish this here, and then we can take it further from the 1930, where the active emergence of English writing in India will be a reality. It is at this time a possibility, but then this possibility will realize itself in the coming decades. So we can talk about that later, but so far as this is concerned, I think that this dilemma has to be understood this way, so that later on one can become clear about the new emergence of writing that will play a different kind of a role in the Indian literary scene. Thank you. Well, friends, this part of the introduction, which is the fourth part, will pertain to the happenings that are there in the Indian writing in English in the fourth decade of the 20th century, that is from 1930 to 1940. I do not want to unnecessarily talk about just 10 years. It's not 10 years, as I have already explained to you in the previous lecture. Things were churning, they were brewing, a kind of foundation was being laid in the previous 30 years. A generation which had participated in the anti-British sentiment, production of the anti-British sentiment, that generation had come into being. And those people who were born in the first decade of the 20th century, let's say from 1900 to 1910, they will be 20, 25 years when it is 1930. And I say 1930 because 1930 is a very specific kind of a year in India's modern history. When the First World War ends in 1917, and Gandhiji at that point of time has already moved to India, and he participated indirectly in the affairs of the Indian politics. He for instance was a kind of bridge between the British state and the Indian political system, and the Indian political system wanted that some concession should be given to the Britishers, and Britishers who had promised the moon to the Indians. They said they will do anything for India at that time because they were caught in the First World War. They started backtracking immediately after the war was over. They were devastated there in Europe. There is no doubt about that. But then they did not want to free the colonies or to give them the kind of liberty that the colonies wanted. And because of which, as soon as the war finishes, the Indian expectations from the British, from their masters are very high. And on the other hand, the British masters are now reluctant to loosen the stranglehold that they have on the country. So this is a very peculiar kind of a situation that occurs in the 1917. So the Britishers are somewhat out of the war. They have partly succeeded, partly they have failed. There is also a new development, a new thorn in the flesh of the world political system, and that thorn is in the form of Russia emerging as the Soviet Union. 1917 is known for two reasons. One, that the war came to an end, and secondly, that a new system of governance and a new system of politics also emerged in the form of Soviet Russia. And Soviet Russia was the first country in the world which successfully adopted socialism. And what is socialism? Socialism is equality of opportunity, equality of facilities to all people who constitute the society, to be governed by socialism. And this is a new system. The world had heard about it, but nobody could see it in its form of functioning, and therefore an inspirational presence of Soviet Russia was the new threat to British imperialism in India and to world capitalism at the world level. So this is one situation, and this situation would have definitely appealed to and inspired the Indian middle classes to understand the reality from their point of view. Suppose I was there in 1917 as a young man, and I saw that the Britishers had lost the battle or partly won the battle, and that they were now trying to stick on to power again in spite of all the promises that they had to us earlier. How would I feel? How would you feel in 1917? Suppose you were 20 years. All of us would have felt cheated. That the Britishers didn't have that kind of level that they should subject us to a different kind of living, and they should enjoy at our cost. Modernism had come. Modern ideas, modern ways of thought, they had come to India, particularly in the Indian middle classes, which were educated, and therefore the second thing, as I said, the emergence of Soviet Russia, that also would have inspired the people to think equal with the Britishers. So how would the Britishers, who were earlier calling Indians mutinous in the 19th century, mutinous means that the Indian forces were taking their money and their livelihood from the Britishers, and they were not true to their salt, and therefore they had mutinied. So now in the 20th century, if somebody talked of mutiny or being disloyal to the master, then people would laugh, because the very idea of somebody being the master and somebody else being the slave, that idea had become redundant. That idea had become moribund. this idea could no more succeed as an inspiring idea. So this was the mood when the World War ended, the First World War ended, and immediately after that Gandhiji became very active, the Congress Party became very active, and Britishers started thinking that if this kind of activity goes on increasing in the country, then very soon India will fight successfully the Britishers and become free. So this was the mood in the 1917, 1918, 1919. How far is the geographical Russia from here? Very, very near. If one compares, the distance between England and India, Russia is just next door. It would be just crossing one or two countries, and then you reach the eastern part of Russia. And in Russia, there was no inequality. There were no masters, there were no rich, there were no poor. Everybody was equal. That's how people understood. And therefore, these two things, came combined. One, that Britishers were still holding on to power, and they had reduced us to the level of slaves. And on the other side, there was a country in the world where there were no masters. So I imagine the kind of mood that would be there in India at that point of time. I am particularly stressing here, in this case, not the Indian writing in Indian languages. I am not talking about Bangla, I am not talking about Hindi, I am not talking about Urdu, I am not talking about other languages. I am talking about English. Those who use English as a medium of expression, those who use English to understand things in the world, those who also think of writing in English, at this point of time, what would these people think? Would they be Indians or would they be followers of English? Now this is a question. It's not just an existential question, it's an intellectual question. It's a question that is very relevant, and I realized that since they were well read, since they had read European literature, they had read English literature, and English literature is very radical. It's very equality oriented. It has Dickens, it has Hardy, it has the earlier great masters of the novel in the 19th century. It has Shakespeare, who always was inspired by the ideals of equality and the ideals of sensitivity, which was there more in the poor people than the rich. So the English has that kind of a tradition of radical thought. And when the English educated intelligentsia in India in the latter part of the second decade of the 20th century, immediately after the First World War, when they start thinking about their role in India, then they would definitely not embrace, they will not definitely adopt the idea of slavery or being second-class citizens to the ones who are Britishers and who have simply white skin. So superiority will not be discussed, will not be determined by the color of one's skin, or by that somebody is a British or somebody is Indian. It will be decided on the basis of equality, and therefore this new thing that earlier was almost unfamiliar, this thing became quite current in the post First World War situation. So I want to stress this as much as possible, because now those who can read English, those who can write in English, those who can speak English, these people are going through a phase of transformation. They will not be English in their manners as the minutes would show in the I talked about them in the 19th century. So now they will not be British in their habits. Maybe under Gandhi's influence, they will shed all their British sense of dress, and they would wear simple Indian dresses. They would march in the open. They would go to the villages. They would mobilize the masses, and you will see an enthusiasm which was unprecedented in India. In the 1920s, one sees that Bangla literature, Hindi literature, Maratha literature, Malayalam literature, these literatures have come forward in such a big manner that the whole world, the whole country is agog with new ideas and with new emotions. And when that happens, do you think that the English-speaking intelligentsia would be untouched? I ask this question, and my answer is that if such a wave is there in the country in 1918, 1919, and in 1919, and around this time, Jallianwala Bagh happens, and what does it show? It shows that the Britishers have become completely insensitive, and that they are intolerant, and that when people sit at one place and they are discussing things which touch their national interests, then they are gunned down. and mercilessly they are killed, and no distinction is made between the soldiers, between the young people, even women and children are killed. So what kind of a message is the British imperialism sending across? And therefore, even those who read English and wrote in English and expressed themselves in English, even they would start doubting and suspecting the Britishers for their intentions. So this is the mood of the ending the last few years of the second decade, and this mood is going to grow further. Now, I can give the example of Bhagat Singh in this case. Bhagat Singh, when is he born? I think he is born somewhere in the first decade of the 20th century, 1907, 1908. Around that time he is born. How old is he when the third decade or the second or the 1920s are happening? He would be just 15 years or so. And he must have passed out from school and would be thinking of going to college. And in the college, as a college student, and he knew English very well himself. And in fact, today we project him as, and we project him as the writer in English. And he is an Indian. And what does he write in English at that point of time? And very soon he will be martyred. When he is martyred sometime in 1930, 1931, he is 24 years. At the age of 24 years, this person has read English, he has expressed himself in English, and he has taken part in the Indian national movement. And he was a product of the reform movement earlier, from where he shifted to Gandhian kind of idealism, and he was also into the militancy, majorly into militancy as a young man, in the college. And from militancy, when he was caught as a militant at that time, then this person reads still more and reads in English, and then he realizes that the path of progress lies in social equality. So when he dies, when he is hanged, at that point of time, he is a revolutionary. He calls himself a Marxist, I think at that time. Marxist-Leninist he called himself. I am talking about this mood, and I am particularly taking the example of Bhagat Singh, because Bhagat Singh is a young man from Punjab who is totally secular and is totally detached from the orthodoxy that might have influenced India at that time. And he writes in English, and he writes poems also. He has written diaries, he has written literary reviews. So I call him a literary writer in his own right, even though he never boasted about his literary prowess. He would talk himself as a revolutionary and a political activist. But what I am saying is that political activism is giving scope to Indians to express themselves in English. It's a new kind of a language. It's a new kind of a medium, and this should not be overlooked. So this is one example. The other example can be of people who write in two languages. Sometimes they write in English. Sometimes there are Gandhiji, for instance, would not write in English now. Gandhiji in the 1920s would be editing a weekly called Harijan, and he would be writing in Hindi. Now the question that is being asked at that time is, why should a great leader from Gujarat not write in Gujarati but write in Hindi? Of course, Gandhiji's answer would be that he would write both in Gujarati and in Hindi, and he would write in any language because his main job is to communicate the message that he has near his heart to the masses. So this is the mood of the post First World War and the the third decade, which is the 1920s in India. And you have examples already where people are using English to express their agony, to express their complaints, to express their grievances, to express their anger. And this is happening in India in these initial years of national sentiment that is coming up. Well, now that this particular point is made, the question can be asked, whether Britishers would be simply bearing with it, or would they would take steps, that this process doesn't go further. And my answer is that as rulers, it will be there. They will be having sleepless nights, and they must be thinking of taking measures that this kind of a trend can be stopped as soon as possible. And therefore, from their side, they would be then contacting people and giving them ideas regarding the division between one part of community and another part of community, and division along religious lines. Because at that point of time, if communalism is spread, if Hindu-Muslim unity is not achieved and Hindu-Muslim division is encouraged, what will happen? The consequence of this will be that India will be divided, it will become weak, and therefore Britishers will enjoy it. Britishers would like to see a divided India against themselves. So they can advance, they can encourage one community at the cost of another, and they can remain smiling. So on their side, they are now sowing seeds of distrust between communities. This thing also is there, and that's why Bhagat Singh takes to secularism. He comes from one community, he comes from the Punjab, community of Sikhs, and he talks about Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims in the same breath. For him, all of them are Indians, and they are supposed to fight the British. So therefore, this kind of an intellectual climate is emerging in the 1920s, and which believes in debate, discussion, propagation of ideas and ideals. So if one has this idea that this is what is right and this is what is wrong, therefore you don't keep this idea to yourself. I as a writer, as a speaker, should not keep this idea to myself, but I should share it with the masses. And therefore the urban centers are providing the youth leaders the opportunity to go to the masses in the villages, to remain there, to mobilize people there, and then come back and see that India is coming up as an alternative to the British regime, and India as an independent country. So this independence is at the root of, is at the heart of the protest movements that happened in the 1920s. And of course, I don't want to go into the writing in other languages, but one example I'm reminded of, and I think I should share it with you. One example is that of a writer like Premchand, who was till 1920 some kind of a reformist, starts now mobilizing the masses along lines of secularism, the lines of political activism. And in another lecture I have said it, but I would like to repeat it, it will be a repetition, that the writer Premchand, who also knew English as well as many others, I've read some of his English pieces too, and he initially wrote in Urdu, but then he started writing in Hindi also. So his fiction is available in both the languages. And this person is visualizing characters who went to England or America, who learned the ideas from those countries. They came back and they established an ashram here, and the ashram is along lines of socialism. I'm referring to his famous novel called Prem Ashram. There's a person called Prem Shankar who found this ashram somewhere in a village, and in the ashram all the people are being treated as equals. So why I'm saying this? I'm saying this because in the 1920s people are using these ideas of equality for mobilizing the masses, and for that whatever language is useful, that should be used. So the charge of elitism, the charge of remaining away from others and feeling superior to other people, that charge is washed off here in the 1920s. Now nobody says English should not be used or Indian languages should be used. Any language can be used in order to keep the movement going, and therefore English now has that kind of a confidence, that kind of self-assurance which was not there until 1920. And one can see that English will finally be one of the modes of expression of the middle class intelligentsia in India. One more thing about that can be said in favor of use of English in the 1920s. Through English, people from different regions, middle classes from different regions, like the Bengalis, like the people from Tamil Nadu, like the people from Kerala, from Maharashtra, those middle classes which understand English. So they can be approached through English at that point of time, and a new kind of unity of the middle classes coming from different areas, that can be established. Maybe that's one reason why English becomes quite strong in the 1920s as opposed to the idea earlier. And now you will see, I give the example of Bhagat Singh, but there are many people in India at that time who are very sensitive, who are very intelligent, very creative. They can imagine and they can give flesh and blood to that particular emotion, and they can make it sound very realistic in the context. These people who are born in the first decade of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1910, these people, when the fourth decade will start, that is 1930, they will be how old? They will be 25 years or so. And as it happens, three pillars of Indian fiction in English, three stalwarts of Indian fiction in English, they emerged together in the 1930s. And I'll just devote some time to this to explain why English writing in India comes into its own in the 1930s with these three pillars. And which are these three pillars? One is Mulk Raj Anand, a writer who was born in Punjab, and he learnt his English later, and then he shifted to England and he came in touch with the ideas of freedom and equality there. Then he comes back and he is interested in knowing India firsthand, and he writes about India, and he writes in English, and he writes one novel after another in English, and in each novel he is talking about the village reality, the small town reality, and the reality of the princely families. So he is able to combine all these sections through his English writing, and he runs a campaign against the Britishers, and he laughs at, he ridicules, he uses sarcasm to attack the Britishers and their interests in his writing. And he is a major writer. He is one of the finest writers that the 20th century produced, and he has a large number of novels, a large number of short stories, and of course other prose things, prose works. There is a small book by him on heroism in India and the tradition of heroism in literature. So he is a big name in literature, and this person is one of the finest pillars of Indian English writing in India. And this person starts writing full length in the 1930s. The other writer is Raja Rao. Raja Rao is known for his Kanthapura, and Kanthapura, that famous novel in English, was written in 1938, when Raja Rao would be around 30 years, born in the first decade of the 20th century. What does Raja Rao do in Kanthapura? What is Kanthapura? Kanthapura is a small town or a village. And see the name he is giving to it. It's an English novel, but then the title is totally Indian, Kanthapura. And Raja Rao in this novel adds a preface which is not even 2 pages. It's 1.5 pages. And there he says something very interesting in that preface. He is talking about the use of English. Now maybe he must have heard from some people that writing in English would not be useful. But then he argues against this idea, and he says, I write in my English. It's not British English. It's not the English of anybody else. This is my English. I as an Indian would write in English. And then he says, and he writes in that kind of English. In fact, if one forgets for some time, this controversy about writing for or against English, and reads this novel, one would realize that the entire content is Indian. In fact, these English sentences in the novel, I've been, analyzing this particular text apart from others for some time, and I realized that in his use of the sentence, he is closer to Sanskrit than he is to English, even though he is writing in English. And some sentences, are as long as half a page. In half a page, one sentence continues. Now, this is the tradition of Sanskrit. In Sanskrit, there are books, where the sentence doesn't come to an end; it goes on and on. So, just imagine that one remains in India, one writes in English, and one molds that English language and the English usage according to the requirements of Indian conditions. So, this person is doing one thing, that he is in a way revolutionizing English and making it Indianized. That is small part. The bigger part is that when he is writing Kanthapura, then he is writing about India symbolically as a big metaphor. And the metaphor is that Kanthapura actually is India, and there is one person who is giving this identity of Kanthapura, and that person is a person called Gandhi. Now, Gandhi is not directly there in the novel, but Gandhi is in the background of it. So, imagine a Gandhian novel and a novel of protest and a novel of nationalism is being written by Raja Rao in the 1930s, and this novel is a pathbreaker. And this novel gave a whole identity to the Indian writing in English by saying, that English should not be, thrown out or should be rejected just because it is the language of the foreigners. Now, it is our language, he says, and in any case, English is the language of the middle classes, in India, and that fact cannot be overlooked. I'm not saying, of course, that Indian languages are less. In fact, Indian languages are much more powerful and strong for the Indian conditions. I myself, mostly write in Hindi, and I also, talk and write in English. But I realized that Indian writing in English should be recognized for what it is, for its content, for its concerns, and not because one is writing in this or that language. Anyway, the last writer, and I finish with him, is R.K. Narayan. R.K. Narayan also the same age as these people. He's also in his 20s, when he's writing in 1930 onwards, and his novels do not belong to the village as much. They don't belong to the city also, and he was not recognized in India first, but now he's supposed to be, if not greater than these two writers, at least equal to them. And his forte, his strong point, his powerful aspect of writing is in his detachment, his humor, and his rationality. Here is a writer who will not say anything very seriously, pompously. In fact, he is against pomposity, and that attack on pomposity brings him very close to the masses, to the ordinary person. So that will show that R.K. Narayan would use his humor. He would use characters in such a manner that one character can work at the threatening the idea and the argument of the other character, and that's how these things can continue. So friends, to conclude, I would say that this is today's conclusion, that when the 1900 onwards a kind of a churning and exploration occurs, that paves the way for Indian writing in English in a decisive manner in the 1930s. And we have three writers. We have many more others, and they have already started writing. One doesn't have to go into them because they will flower into their literary excellence in the 1940s and later. For that, there will be another course. But so far as we are concerned, then we part with this idea that 1930s are the apex and the great heights of Indian writing in English, and that there can be a series of discussions on the fiction writing of the 1930s, independent of what has been said about others. So finally, I would say that in these lectures, I have tried to explain to you the rationale of this course. This course is a reality. This course recognizes the trend of English writing in India from where it emerged in the 18th century. It then explored its way through the 19th century, and in the 20th century it faced certain dilemmas, and when those dilemmas finally got sorted out under the pressure of the national movement, then it saw a kind of a zenith, a kind of a height of excellence in the writing of these three giants of Indian English writing. And well, incidentally, all these three giants are fiction writers. So with this, I come to the end of the introductory part, and from next time onwards, we'll be taking up specific trends or specific texts. So till that time, thank you, and well, I hope you would be able to respond to it properly.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a very, very productive session once again. And dear friends, if you have any queries or if you want to give your feedback for this particular lecture, then you can mail us at info.cec@nic.in. We would be meeting again very soon and would be discussing another topic under the series Indian Writing in English. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.